Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for yet another EarthEcho STEMExplore virtual career connection. Today we are featuring Dr. Ashley Smith and we're so excited to have her with us today. My name is Casey and I'm a programs manager here at EarthEcho International. And EarthEcho is a nonprofit organization founded on the belief that youth have the power to change our planet. Now, we have reached more than 2 million people in 146 countries with our programming, and we're so excited to bring a program just like this one to all of you out there tuning in today. And this program is part of our STEMExplore, EarthEcho's program that brings inspiration to life by telling the stories of dynamic female professionals in STEM careers during live virtual career connections, just like this one. We, of course, want to thank our sponsor, Raytheon Technologies, for their support of women in STEM. So for those of you joining us today, I do want to remind you that you can send questions in via chat, and we will break throughout today's presentation to answer your questions. For those of you who are live and in Zoom, please use that Q&A feature to drop your questions in. Helps us to organize it a little bit better. If you're catching this on YouTube, feel free to use that chat space, and we will break several times throughout today's program to ask questions of Dr. Smith as we go along. All right, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. I would like to introduce Dr. Ashley Smith. Now, Dr. Smith studies water quality and nutrient cycles in coastal habitats like oyster reefs, mangroves, and seagrass beds. Ashley's interest in biogeochemistry began after an undergrad research experience where she realized the impact human activities have on nutrient cycles, and she really enjoyed being covered in mud. And we'll hear all about that today. Ashley went on to earn a PhD in marine science from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and was a David H. Smith Conservation Research Postdoctoral Fellow at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. Her research is centered on understanding how coastal habitats such as oyster reefs, salt marshes, and seagrass beds process and remove nutrients and how human activities alter this ecosystem function. At UF, Ashley is researching the effects of climate change and sea level rise and have coastal and marine ecosystems and ways to use coastal habitats for protection. Now, recently, Dr. Smith has been working with the Scientist in Every Florida School program. And this program is one of our partnerships that we have here at EarthEcho. It is a free program whose mission is to build long-term collaborative relationships between teachers and scientists to better integrate current scientific research and big data into classroom lessons that adhere to Florida Sunshine State standards. For more information about how to get involved with this program, we will have those details towards the end of our program today. So, Dr. Smith, sorry about that long introduction. How are you today? We're so excited to have you here with us.
I'm well, thank you for having me.
Wonderful. It is great to see you here today. I love your virtual background. Super topical. This is great. We're super excited for your presentation today to take us along your journey in your STEM career. So why don't we just go ahead and get started? And can you tell us, let's just get started about talking about your work. What is it that you do?
So I'm a biogeochemist, and so I'm studying how nutrients like carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus move between our air, soil, and water.
Excellent. Sounds good. So let's see here. Can you tell us a little bit more about if folks want to become a marine biologist, and you can go ahead and share your slides at this time if you want.
Okay.
If they want to become a marine biologist, you want to kind of start there because that is a super broad term. My background is also in marine science, but a lot of people just say, I want to be a marine biologist, but that can mean many, many different things. So if you want to tell us a little bit more about that, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, that's exactly what I get all the time. I hear this question from a lot of people when I tell them that I am a marine biologist. And they're like, oh, I want to be a marine biologist. And I think the impression that we get when you hear that term is that you're going to go out and study and study sea turtles or lionfish or even manatee. This is some of my colleagues looking at some manatee. But marine biologists study so much more than that. And in fact, we're all over and we study lots of different things. So I put together some photos here of some of my other colleagues looking at different aspects of marine biology. This is my colleague Maya looking at macroalgae. That's codium, dead man's fingers. It's a green algae. Then the middle is Savannah looking at, she studies horseshoe crabs, and she actually runs a whole program to help people as a citizen science program to go look for horseshoe crabs when they come to lay their eggs. And then we also study coral reefs, not necessarily the big animals that live on the coral reefs, but the coral themselves and the fish and microbes that live there as well. But marine biologists can also just study mud or sediments. This is a photo of a colleague looking at mud from a marsh. Or they can study the water. This is a photo of another colleague of mine taking measurements of the depth of a river and then taking measurements of salinity, temperature, and dissolved oxygen. And then this is me. So I study with the mud and the water and how they interact and how what happens in the mud can influences the water, and what happens in the water can influence what happens in the mud or the sediment. So while technically I am a marine biologist, my specific field is coastal biogeochemistry. So what is biogeochemistry? I put here the textbook definition on the slide for everybody, and I'm going to read it because it's very boring. Biogeochemistry is the scientific discipline that involves the study of chemical, physical, geological, and biological processes and reactions that govern the composition of the natural environment, including the biosphere, the cryosphere, the hydrosphere, the pediosphere, the atmosphere, and the lithosphere. Wow, that's a mouthful. Even just reading that, I think, well, I study everything. What don't I do? And that's part of the fun about biogeochemistry. When I think about biogeochemistry, I think of it as being the study of the chemicals and how chemicals move between different parts of our environment and the role that plants, animals, and microbes play in that movement. So you can break this apart then, and the bio is the plants, animals, microbes. The chemistry is those nutrients like carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus. And then the geo part is the sediments or the parts of our Earth ecosystem and the ecosystem. So as a biogeochemist, I get to have a lot of great adventures. These are just some of my photos from fieldwork. We usually are out in a boat, on a river, in a marsh, on the ocean, in the estuary, trying to get to our field sites. Those days where we're in the field are some of my most favorite days. They usually involve us taking some sediment samples, like down here in the middle. We take with like PVC cores, like my colleague Melanie is holding there, and we push those into the marsh mud or to the sediments. And we get this like great mud texture and feelings and sample to take and play with. But then we also get to go kayaking and spend time in mangroves or tromping around oyster reefs to take our samples and look at what's happening in the water, in the sediment, and then what the environment looks like overall. Because what we're really after is what happens, how human activities are affecting these environments. I also get to spend, well, I do spend a lot of time above water, I spend some time underwater. Here is some video that I recently collected looking at organisms that live near docks and how docks can affect shading and plant growth, and then some of these biogeochemical processes that I'm really interested in.
And Ashley, you might have to hit play on the bottom of that.
If you look closely, you can see some of the different critters that I run into during my adventures. And so I still get to see some of these organisms and interact with the environment in the way that you think of when you think of being as a marine biologist. That was a pretty cool stingray that swam right through my camera. But it's really the sediments that get me the most excited. So a typical day, ooh, that was play again, sorry. A typical day for me then involves taking those samples that I got from the field and bringing them back into the lab. I would say that of my entire schedule, only about 15% of my time is actually spent in the field. The rest of it is back in the lab or in my office looking at data. These are some of my, go ahead.
We do have a question coming in about some of your field work. Do you ever run into alligators?
Now that I live in Florida, I'm always on the lookout, but I haven't had any that have come into my field sites yet. So
perfect.
Yeah, it's definitely something I tell my students before they go out sampling. Watch out for alligators. And then I had this crazy idea that I wanted to go and look at the effects that those alligators have as they move around and turn up the mud, and what that might do. That's bioturbation. And all my friends were like, that seems a little dangerous. So maybe I'll work up to that. But so my typical day then is mostly what we see here, where we are running samples on different instruments. This is a mass spec where we're looking for the different masses of gases that are dissolved in water. And we can use those data to really understand these biogeochemical cycles, like the nitrogen cycle or the carbon cycle, and what processes might be upregulated or downregulated based on the environmental conditions. We get those data back, and then we get to analyze them using statistics, and then we have to write our paper, because I personally don't believe that science is complete until it's put into practice. So even whatever data I generate in the lab is only really useful if somebody is only really beneficial if someone can actually use it. So that's, while it's all glory and fun when we're in the lab and in the field, a lot of my time is actually spent looking at the data, which I think is just as exciting as I'm trying to figure out the story that it's trying to tell me. I've been pretty lucky because I've been able to go to a variety of different places. I did my PhD in North Carolina. Now I live in Florida. I started out in Philadelphia, and then I went to Virginia for a little bit, and I've even been to Kansas. So all these, what I really like about my field is that all of these locations, nutrients are cycling. And sure, the drivers and the systems might be a little different. Like, we have mangroves in Florida. We don't have mangroves in Philadelphia. But I'm able to ask questions about how these nutrients cycle in those environments. And that gives me the chance to take my skills and my knowledge and really go all over the US, even into Ohio. But the one thing that underscores all of my work is really my love for mud. There, I said it, I love mud. I love everything about mud. I love the smell of it, that like rotten egg smell that people kind of turn their nose up at. The feel of it, how when you put your hands in it, it feels like uncooked brownies, but then that's the smell at the same time. Oh, and then even just like the way that what's happening in the sediment and the microbes and bugs and critters that live there are invisible to the naked eye, yet what they're doing is so important for how we function on Earth and how Earth as a system even functions. I get so excited trying to figure out the stories that all my sediment cores like this are trying to tell me. This photo is actually the first sediment core that I ever took. A sediment core is the plastic tube and that you push into the ground, and out comes your core, and that's that deep sample of sediments. I didn't always know that I wanted to be a biogeochemist, but I did know that I liked to be outside, and that I liked water, and that I liked math. So when I started out college, I think I did, like most people, I wanted to be a medical doctor. I quickly learned that I don't really like people, and I don't really like blood. So I changed my major to environmental studies, and I looked to find internships to gain some real world experiences. Luckily, I was awarded an internship in biogeochemistry at the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia. This was great because I'm from Philly, so I could spend the summer living at home and not having to pay rent. And I also thought that biogeochemistry was everything. It's all the sciences in one. It was really going to give me some experience that would help me decide which kind of direction I wanted to take my career.
And Ashley, we have a question coming in from Barbara, and kind of going along the lines of this, of how you got into your career and the pathways that you took there. So taking it a step back from your collegiate career, when you were in high school, were there any special marine biology programs that you encountered?
No, when I was in high school, I would spend my summers at the Jersey Shore. So I grew to love the marine ecosystems from that time. But the one in high school, we did offer this class that was called Problems in Research. It was just like I had to give up my lunch, but that was fine. And you worked with like one or two other students and the faculty member to design a research project. My project was looking at wastewater. So every week I would have to go over to our local wastewater treatment plant where I would collect 2 5-gallon buckets of stage 2 wastewater. So this has been pretty treated, but I was trying to get the community that was in this wastewater to grow and to so we could maximize the nitrogen removal that was happening then. I didn't realize it at the time, but now, reflecting back on my past experiences, I realized that was my first real introduction to biogeochemistry. And it was in this applied context.
Yeah. That's really amazing that you can, and of course, now that you know what a biogeochemist does, because you are one, but it's really interesting to kind of think back and say, oh my gosh, I realized this love for it way back when, and I was doing this weird thing, because that doesn't sound like the most glamorous job in the world.
Definitely not the most glamorous.
And we recently had a virtual event with a wastewater treatment plant, and it is incredible, all of the skill sets that folks there use, and all the different sciences that wastewater management has to use as well. That's pretty incredible. So kind of moving into that college realm, can you tell us a little bit more kind of your journey, your educational journey, of how you got to where you are today?
Yeah. So when I started out college, I actually went to Baylor University in Waco, Texas. At Baylor, I quickly realized that I missed seasons, although now I live in Miami, so I still guess I miss seasons. And I also didn't like being that far away from home. So I transferred to UNC Chapel Hill. And then that was when I decided that I really needed this internship experience to sort of, as a transfer student, you're a little bit behind in classwork, and you're not all your credits transferred, so the internship was really like to set me up to be more successful going forward. The summer after my internship, where I collected the sediment core, I took a class called Biogeochemical Cycling. And it was an upper level undergrad class. And in that class, you're talking about the sulfur cycle. I love the sulfur cycle. It's that rotten egg smell that you get, that's sulfur. And I told our professor about this research project that I had done that past summer. And on the spot in that class, he made me give my final presentation from that summer. And this was a little intimidating, but we got through it. And after that, he says, come with me to my office. Okay. So I walk with him to his office, and he calls this new faculty member, Mike Peeler, out of the blue with me in his office on speakerphone, telling him how he needs to hire me because I was about to finish college and didn't have a job, and he knew that Mike was looking for a technician. So fast forward, I ended up moving down to the Institute of Marine Science for UNC, which is in Morehead City, North Carolina, and I worked for Mike for about a year. Into that job, Mike, it was coming up to the end of the contract, and Mike comes to me and goes, so what are you going to do now? I'm like, I don't know. he goes, well, I don't have any money left to pay your salary as a technician, but I have money to pay for you as a graduate student. Do you want to take all the work you've been doing and turn it into a quick master's thesis? I was like, sure, sounds good. I like what I'm doing. If I can get a degree from it, that would be great. So that quick master's thesis turned into a 6-year PhD. What happened is during that time, Mike and I wrote a grant together that got funded. So that was able to extend my career there. But it was also, my work was focused on coastal ecosystems like oyster reefs, salt marshes, seagrass beds, and how they process and remove nutrients. But in this like sea level rise context, so as sea level rise happens, you're going to get some habitats that might die off, like seagrasses will become inundated, it's too salty. So you lose those services that the seagrass would provide, but at the same time, homeowners might restore oyster reefs because they provide shoreline protection. So you're going to gain those services. So in doing this research, I realized that we knew nothing about oyster reefs, and everyone's talking about how oyster reefs are going to improve water quality because they're this filter feeding bivalve, or how they're going to save our shorelines because they build reefs. But as I dug through the literature, what we knew about oysters and their ability to actually improve water quality came from one study that used pelletized phytoplankton to mimic the effects of oysters. So this is basically like fake algae that they're using to see what an oyster would do to the environment. So my entire dissertation, or my entire research changed, and instead of focusing on sea level rise and ecosystem benefits trade-offs, I focused completely on oysters, and really tried to get this understanding for how oysters can improve water quality. So oysters are filter feeders. So as there's nutrients enter our system, and that's when we see that water that changes to like guacamole colored green. And oysters will eat that algae. They'll process it, and some of it gets assimilated, taken up into their biomass for their shell and tissue as they grow. What they don't use ends up in the sediments as their biodeposits. These biodeposits are just like juicy organic matter, like donuts for microbes, and they're just going to go to town and munch on that. And in doing that, they can actually, microbes and the sediments can actually take the nitrogen that fed the algae that turned the water green and turn it back into N2 gas, which is a removal mechanism, because the majority of our atmosphere is N2 gas. 78% of it is N2 gas. So we want nitrogen to be in that form. We don't want it to be in the form that would feed the algae. So I worked for my PhD then on really trying to maximize this benefit. So if you restore an oyster reef next to a seagrass bed, what does that do? If you restore an oyster reef in this salinity, what does that do? If you restore an oyster reef that's this kind of structure, or like three-dimensional structure, what does that do to these water quality benefits? After I finished my PhD, I ended up getting a fellowship from the Society of Conservation Biology. It's the Smith Fellowship. It's run through the Cedar Tree Foundation. And I took my work up the coast to Virginia, where I worked at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. Now, I did sort of shift my direction here because I started to work on aquaculture. My thought was that aquacultured oysters could provide the same benefits as oysters in a natural system because they're still filter feeding, even though they're raised for consumption. And they might also take the pressure off of that wild population then and let them continue to do this benefit, continue to filter, while providing jobs and tasty treats for us in an aquaculture context. So I spent the next couple of years comparing aquacultured oysters to natural oysters in terms of their ability to process and remove nitrogen. And guess what? They're about the same. So it doesn't really matter if your oysters are in aquaculture or from a reef, they're still performing this function and providing us this benefit of water quality and nitrogen removal. There are factors about the farm and the way that the aquaculture operation is managed that can actually can provide more of a benefit than others. So I got to work a lot with the growers to kind of figure out how farm management can be used to maximize this benefit. But the one thing that came from my time at VIMS and even in UNC was that I was a little tired of thinking about the way that how we can remove nitrogen once it's already in our coastal systems. So, and I realized that to really fix this nitrogen pollution problem so that we don't have the waters turn green, I needed to go to the source. And that was when I moved to Kansas. So I moved about as far away as one could get from the ocean. And I was able to work on projects that were focused on restoring wetlands and agricultural lands or other different best management practices in the Midwest that could trap nutrients before they enter the water. Because we all live in a watershed. And in Kansas, the watershed drains down into the Gulf of Mexico. So if we can figure out what we can do on land to then protect what happens further down in the water and protect our water quality. Sort of like what they say in Finding Nemo, all drains lead to the ocean. All rivers lead to the coast too. So this was my chance to kind of put on my biogeochemist's hat and think about nitrogen in a way that I haven't really thought about nitrogen before, and the way that plants, instead of filter feeders, can interact with the nitrogen cycle, and how factors like slope, rain, drying, and re-wetting could affect the ability for the service to be provided as a trapping of the nutrients. But collectively, these experiences then led me down to Florida. And I think it's actually the most perfect place for me to be, because I get to think about food, so like aquaculture, and the environment all the time. And I also get to think about how to put that work into the hands of people who need it, because the University of Florida is the land-grant university for the state. So we have extension appointments, and extension is extending data. So part of my job requires me to put data into the hands of people who use it. So I work directly with aquaculturists in Florida Sea Grant to do that. I've been at UF since 2017, and I get to get really muddy here. I get to go up to Cedar Key, where I'm looking at clam aquaculture, or down over here where I live, I tromping around the mangroves and these urban mangroves and seeing what the effects of our development are doing to these valuable ecosystems and how we might be able to use those for designing, for combating sea level rise. And I'm also looking at how saltwater intrusion can affect biogeochemistry. South Florida is ground zero for sea level rise, and the lessons that we learn here will only help prepare us as a East Coast for what we're up against in the future. I am slowly adapting to the South Florida lifestyle. In fact, these sediment cores that you're looking at now are taken from Biscayne Bay, and I actually took them from a yacht. I was able to take my first sediment cores where somebody was toweling me off and handing me water. That was how I knew that I had really made it to South Florida. It's all of these pieces that have come together that have really helped to motivate me as to trying to figure out how we can meet our demand for food and continue to feed our growing population while also protecting our environment. And that's really what my goal and my passion is about. So at the end of the day, I get to spend my day looking at data, playing with oysters, talking about oysters and these awesome little filter feeders, looking at mud, and thinking about how human activities can impact the environments that we love. So the specific topics that I get to investigate are related to water quality in wetlands and estuaries, how nutrients move through our ecosystems, and then sea level rise and oysters. And I'm happy to talk about that with any of you today.
That is awesome. That is so great, Ashley. Thank you so much for sharing that story. Now, we do have quite a few questions. And one of them specifically, let's see here. So you did talk about the smell of the mud and being out there. So Barbara wants to know, is the smell a good sign for marine life?
Oh, Barbara, that's a good question. So the smell is sulfide, and sulfide is toxic. So you don't want to have too much sulfide buildup, because then that's when you'll get like seagrass die-offs down here in Florida Bay. But it's also a symptom indicating that there is some good biogeochemistry happening and there is good organic matter. So it's a sign that things are working like they should, but you don't want it to build up too much.
Yeah, I always think of when you did talk about that, and then when Barbara sent that question, and I giggled a little bit because I live in South Florida as well, and my husband and I, we love to go kayaking and paddleboarding and tromp around in the beautiful nature that we have here. And every time if we hit, say, a mangrove forest, and that smell just kind of hits you in the face, I say, ooh, it smells productive here.
Yeah. There's a difference. There's a slight difference between that smell of like just organic matter decomposing versus sulfide.
Yep.
And that like transition is like one of my favorite smells, where you get that like difference. So like mangroves are actually, they're able to tolerate the sulfide buildup. So a lot of these habitats are designed to live in these kinds of conditions.
That's great. So we do have another question coming in. And by the way, for those of you tuning in, feel free to drop those questions into the Q&A space and the chat, and we'll ask those of Dr. Smith. So another question, very topical right now, is can you explain the sulfur cycle a little bit more?
So the sulfur cycle is not my expertise, but it's mostly, so nitrogen is my favorite cycle because there's so many different ways that nitrogen can cycle and different forms of nitrogen. Sulfur doesn't have as many forms, and it's a little bit more in the sediment side. But the main reaction that happens with the sulfur cycle is sulfate reduction. So that is when you get sulfate that goes to form sulfide. And that process is like happens a lot in marine systems because sulfate is actually our most common ion in seawater. We think of it as being chlorine, but it's not, it's sulfate. And when we get that sulfate coming into systems, then those microbes will use that as they respire. So it's basically like how we break down organic matter with oxygen, microbes will break it down with sulfide or sulfate, and then they'll produce sulfide. So that's like the main reaction that I study in the sulfur cycle. You're muted.
We want to give, that was perfectly explained. Thank you very much. And I do want to give one of our viewers out there, Ronan, a little shout out. He is one of our Water Challenge ambassadors, so it's so good to see him here. Now, Ronan is wondering, do you know about the Billion Oyster Project in New York City?
I do, and I also know about the 5 billion oyster project in Chesapeake Bay.
All right. So since he asked that question, his question was, what are your opinions about the Billion Oyster Project in New York City? And I'm going to be completely honest and let you know that I have never heard of either of those. So could you explain maybe both of those projects, your knowledge of that?
Yeah. So those projects are both related to exactly what I study about oysters and how we can use oysters to improve water quality. So oysters have declined in area and extent to only about 1% of what they were just a century ago because of disease, habitat loss, changes in the environment, and then, well, let's face it, they're tasty. So and at the same time, we've also seen this big decrease in water quality. So we're seeing algal blooms, we're seeing dead zones. One of the ways to combat this has been, well, oysters are the solution to all of this. So if we can restore oyster reefs, put oysters back into the environment, we'll get this benefit, and they'll be able to clean the water, and we'll remove the nitrogen, remove the pollutants, and we'll be able to recover from that water. recover the water quality again. So in Long Island Sound, they have the 1 billion oyster project, and their goal is to have 1 billion oysters back into the environment with the hopes that they'll clean the water. In Chesapeake Bay, they're doing the same thing, except more, bigger area. And part of this is so that they can meet some of their government mandated pollution diet restrictions, like total maximum daily loads. So I think that if I upscale the data that I have on oysters and nitrogen removal, and we put this in context of how much these different water bodies are trying to remove from their, like, to meet these government mandated nitrogen diets, they're a fraction of what they would need. So I think that oysters are a really good tool in the toolbox, but they're not the solution. And so I appreciate what these two programs are doing to bring attention to them, but I don't think that they're going to be the cure-all. We have to go to the source.
So along these lines, Barbara wants to know, are scallops also helpful in the way that oysters are?
So most filter feeding bivalves will provide some type of water quality benefits. Oysters provide a lot. So oysters are not a very selective filter feeder. They'll filter whenever they're underwater. So you get a lot more of the filtration benefits with them than you do with other bivalves. And they also form these big reefs. So you get a bunch of other services too, which is why I think that they get the most attention.
Okay, great. And I know I've listened to a lot of really interesting podcasts about oysters and how efficient they are at filtering water. So this is really great, just to kind of build off of everything I've learned before. So Hannah wants to know, she says, in school we learned about nitrogen fixation, but it wasn't explained in that much detail. So could you possibly explain what that is and what research is currently being done related to nitrogen fixation?
Sure. So nitrogen fixation is the process that takes the nitrogen that's in our atmosphere as N2 gas and breaks it into nitrogen that's in the bioavailable form. So the majority of nitrogen is trapped in our atmosphere. 78% of it is N2 gas, and that N2 gas has a triple bond. So it's really, really hard to break. It takes a lot of energy to break it. Certain microbes, cyanobacteria, can break this bond. Lightning can break the bond. And then in doing that, you liberate these two nitrogens, and then they'll bond with oxygen or hydrogen like right away, and you get nitrate or ammonium. And those are forms of nitrogen that plants and animals can actually use for their energy, for our cells. So nitrogen fixation is taking that atmospheric nitrogen and turning it into a usable form. We also do this synthetically, and that's how we have fertilizer.
Okay, great. Thank you. That was really helpful. Barbara also wants to know what causes brown tide. Now, Barbara, I don't know where you are at geographically. I know down here in Florida, we get red tide, and I can definitely help explain any of that too. So do you want to speak a little bit to some of those tides? I'm trying to think of the correct vocabulary term.
Yeah, so they're all
related I should say.
They're all related to the different algae that ends up taking off or blooming. So we have red tide down here, which is, oh gosh, I never get it. It's Brevia
Carenia brevia.
There you go. And then, and red tide down here actually happens sort of naturally anyway, but what happens now is that we have too many nutrients coming into these systems, and it just like continues to happen and happen and happen. So the majority of our algal blooms are all related to sort of nutrients, and then it's just a matter of the other conditions that will dictate who really takes off.
Yeah, that's a really good explanation. And here in Florida with the red tide, the Carenia brevis, some of the other scientists that I've worked with previously, it's a really interesting analogy, that I've heard used in comparing it to forest fires, and how natural red tides can, in fact, they're not necessarily a bad thing. They've been around for millions of years. It's been happening. It is a cycle of nutrients, so much like a forest fire. And now, of course, in fact, I was just camping this weekend, and there was prescribed burns happening. And so that is a cycling of nutrients. It kind of helps the environment to replenish itself. But as you said, Dr. Smith, that definitely if there's too many nutrients, we are contributing to an excess of nutrients. And I guess Barbara is from Long Island, New York. And so that puts a little context to why she asked that question. And also Ronan, who I know is in Manhattan, he said that there are really bad algal blooms in New York City public parks and lakes right now. So it's really interesting to kind of see how all of that ties together. Everything is connected.
Yeah, a lot of the so if you see your lakes or your stormwater ponds and that's fresh water, oysters will not help there. But sometimes just having an aerator in those will allow enough turnover that you won't get that bloom.
Excellent, excellent. So we have a question coming in from John. Oceans have a lot of plastic debris. Do you find much plastic in the mud and rivers that you explore?
Depends where we're at. Sometimes some of the work I did outside of Philly, which is more of an urban setting, we'll find everything like shopping carts, lots of just marine debris. So I haven't specifically looked at the individual microplastics that are in our oysters or our mud, but there's new studies that are showing that we're seeing more and more. And I think that the challenge is going to be that it's already everywhere. We just now need to figure out what it's doing and if it does have an effect. So.
Absolutely. And I know Sea Grant, who you work with, they have a really great program on microplastics here in the state of Florida. And I do believe Dr. Maya McGuire even made your presentation earlier. She was in one of those photographs. So here at EarthEcho with STEMExplore, we like to talk about realities of your career, the journey that you've been on. So can you tell us a little bit about some realities someone might expect if they wanted to follow in your footsteps to become a biogeochemist? For example, how much money would somebody be able to make doing this?
Yeah. Well, so salary is not what always that high in our field. I actually, when I was a postdoc, I only made about $30,000 a year. And I also had to move a lot. I think that's the biggest challenge, is that you don't get paid a lot of money, but you work a lot and you have to be really passionate about it. And you have to be willing to move sometimes for the opportunities. So even in my current position, our salary is fair. It's reasonable, but it's not I'm not making banker's salary.
Yeah, absolutely. These different careers that we explore are vastly different from one another. But of course, if you tend to go in the biological sciences, they're not always the best paid, but they are some of the most rewarding for sure. So here at EarthEcho, Dr. Smith, we believe that we can act now for a sustainable future. So thinking about your work and your field in general, how would you say that your work contributes to a sustainable future?
Yeah, so I think my work is helping with this. How can we meet the demand for food and continue to support our environment? So I with this, what we're showing here, it's shellfish aquaculture. Is it a win-win-win? It can be a win for us because we get to eat these tasty treats and they take the pressure off of the wild population, so we can let them recover to get some of those other services. And also aquaculture can provide jobs for our local economy. So I think my work is all about building both a sustainable future that has humans in the equation and making sure that we are all winning in this together.
Excellent. And I do know we do have another question coming in, so I do want to get to that. Are you familiar with New York's MTA artificial reef program?
I am not.
Okay, that we had a question about that, about studying the effects of it. So don't always know everything, right?
Is it an artificial? Oh, I guess it's not a conversation. Yeah, so there's artificial reefs that we have down here that are designed for fish, for habitat for corals. So it might be really it might not be oysters.
That's what I was wondering. I haven't heard of that one specifically at all, so I definitely can't lend any knowledge to that. Do you want to speak a little bit to any artificial reefs, and do we use oysters for artificial reefs?
So artificial reefs for diving and coral reef recovery, we don't really use oysters. But we do use oysters to build our own oyster reefs. If you go to a seafood restaurant, a lot of the times, and you order oysters, a lot of the times they'll actually recycle your oyster shells, and they'll partner with some nonprofits. And recycling those oyster shells, you set them out to cure for 3 months, and then they'll package them back into like bags or some sort of structure that they can put back into the environment. So you're basically creating a new reef that doesn't have any live oysters on it yet, but you're setting that structure there so that they'll come out and they'll recruit. There's some studies that show that you want to use oyster shells for this because they create this like soundscape. So the baby oysters will know where to settle based on the sound environment around the oyster reef.
Interesting. That's a really fun fact. That's cool. So I did get a little bit of background on that specific artificial reef project that our viewer was asking about. And apparently it is some artificial reefs that are created with old subway cars and train cars that are put into the ocean along the coast off of Long Island in New Jersey and down to Georgia and North Carolina.
There was a movement a while ago to, like in North Carolina, they were putting in, even in Florida, they were putting in like big tractor tires, 18-wheelers. And then after one hurricane, that was all that was on the beach. So really.
Yep, I do remember that. That wasn't, I feel like it was within maybe 10 years ago. Something like that.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, it is interesting. And I know there is quite a bit of debate about artificial reefs out there using man-made structures as artificial reefs. So,
so like oysters wouldn't even like grow on a plate on that. They're probably way too deep, way too big, that like they're just not in the right environment for oysters.
Absolutely. And apparently the project is called Sea Train. Very
Makes
interesting.
sense.
I'm going to have to look that up when we're done. So, so Dr. Smith, can you tell us, do you have any words of advice? If there's any students out there tuning in that might want to follow in your footsteps, become a biogeochemist, not only because it has the best name for a career ever, but also it is really great for the environment and you're doing really, really good work. What kind of words of wisdom would you impart on students out there?
I think math is important. I use math all the time. And it's also sort of take opportunities as they come, because sometimes you don't know what that's going to turn into. And you only learn what you love by learning what you don't love. But what I think about, and I see this as a quote every day, is be who you are and say what you feel, because those who mind don't matter and those who matter don't mind. So unless you want to speak for yourself and say what you're thinking, because your opinion is really valuable.
I love that quote. That's such a good quote. That was wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Ashley. This was such a pleasure to speak with you and to hear about your career. It's really amazing and interesting how vast biological sciences are, but marine science in general. And I think you've definitely given folks something to think about, and your work is tremendous.
Thank you.
So thanks for coming today. We're so excited to have you as one of our STEMExplore mentors this year. And for those of you tuning in, you can follow along with Ashley's work. We've got some social media handles here, and Ashley was kind enough to give us her own Twitter handle if you want to follow her, as well as her email too. So if you do have any other questions that are kind of hard-hitting, feel free to send her a note, but you can always contact us here at EarthEcho as well, and we can definitely answer any questions, but also put you in touch with Dr. Smith. So thank you again, Ashley, for joining us.
Thank you.
And for everyone out there, please subscribe to EarthEcho's social media channels, our YouTube channel. We have a lot of programming going on all the time here at EarthEcho, and we have a lot of really wonderful resources out there. So be sure to check out our website, earthecho.org, where you can learn all about our tremendous programs, such as this one, STEMExplore, but we have a lot of other resources there for you to offer as well. And again, we want to thank our STEMExplore sponsor, Raytheon Technologies, for their support of women in STEM, just like Dr. Smith. And for all of you tuning in out there, thank you so much for joining us. Please stay safe, stay healthy, and keep exploring. Bye-bye, everyone.